Welcome back to Askewed Reviews, and we are continuing with the Valentine's recommendations, and this is a viewer request for the 1990 film Pretty Woman. Here is your trivia question for today. What song is Vivian singing while taking a bubble bath? The answer will be at the end of this episode. So, at the beginning of our film, we meet Edward Lewis, who happens to be a corporate raider from New York City. Now, what he does is he manages to acquire and purchase companies that are failing and then dismantles them and sells them off piece by piece for profit. We quickly find out that Edward has some issues when it comes to relationships, more specifically, keeping them. So one night while he's on a business trip in the Hollywood Hills of California, he seems to be a bit depressed. So he borrows his lawyer's car to go for a bit of a joyride and eventually ends up on the Hollywood Boulevard. It's here where he ends up running into our other main character, Vivian Ward, who happens to be a prostitute. So at the time, it seems that Edward is lost, so Vivian offers to show him the way to his hotel. On the way there, Edward ends up finding Vivian very fascinating, so much so that he ends up inviting her up into his room to spend the evening together. Throughout the evening, Edward and Vivian get to know each other quite a bit and end up really enjoying each other's company. The following morning, Edward has a proposition for Vivian. If she's willing to just hang out with him and spend time with him for a week, at the end of that time, he will pay her $3,000. Vivian excitedly agrees to the terms. While spending time together, Edward begins to realize that perhaps he doesn't have to be alone, and Vivian begins to realize that maybe she doesn't have to continue to live this life that she's ended up in. Edward shows Vivian the week of a wealthy socialite, taking her to get the most expensive clothes, taking her to fancy restaurants, to the opera, and to social events. So at the end of this little experiment, will Edward and Vivian find happiness together, or will they both realize that they're just kidding themselves? This movie was directed by Gary Marshall. Marshall very much encouraged improvisation on set, and that's actually where we got this famous moment between Richard Gere and Julia Roberts, where he snaps the jewelry box on her finger. That reaction she has was true and genuine because she didn't know that it was coming, and the filmmakers liked it so much that they kept it into the movie. Now, Gary Marshall doesn't technically make a cameo in the film, but his voice does. There's a quick sequence where Edward is actually pulling up to a homeless person trying to figure out where Beverly Hills is. And the voice you hear talking to Edward is actually Gary Marshall. Apparently, Werner Herzog was also a potential director for this film. So the original title for the film was not actually Pretty Woman, but just $3,000. Now, Touchstone, who was owned by Disney, didn't really like the implications of using that as the title, and they had actually just recently gotten the rights to Roy Orbison's song Pretty Woman, and decided to rename it as such. Now, in the original script, the character of Vivian was actually going to be a cocaine addict. In fact, she was going to be dealing with withdrawal that entire week when she was with Edward. Now, if you think that's dark, wait till I tell you about the original ending in the script. So apparently, Edward was going to drop Vivian off at the exact same spot that he picked her up at the end of that week. They would get into a fight, and because she had fallen in love with him, she would refuse the $3,000. He then would angrily throw the money down at her feet and drive away. Vivian would then pick up the money and go home. From here, we would see that Vivian would decide to use some of that money to fulfill her best friend and roommate Kit's lifelong dream of going to Disneyland. I am really glad that they changed the ending. So, in my own opinion, I feel that Julia Roberts was perfect casting as Vivian Ward, but there were apparently quite a few other actresses up for that role, including Molly Ringwald, Meg Ryan, Drew Barrymore, Winona Ryder, Diane Lane, Uma Thurman, Jodie Foster, Daryl Hannah, Joan Cusack, Jennifer Connelly, Sarah Jessica Parker, Valeria Golino, Kristen Davis, Leah Thompson, Sandra Bullock, Michelle Pfeiffer, Emily Lloyd, Lauren Holly, Karen Allen, Jennifer Jason Leigh, Brooke Shields, Patricia Arquette, and Mary Steenburgen. Now, when it comes to Richard Gere as Edward Lewis, I do think he did a good job, but I also have to say, just seeing his performance, I do feel it probably would have been pretty easy to swap someone else in as the role. Now, other actors that were up for that role were Burt Reynolds, Al Pacino, Christopher Reeve, John Travolta, Albert Brooks, Sylvester Stallone, Dennis Quaid, Harrison Ford, Bruce Campbell, Danny Glover, John Hurd, Christopher Lambert, Sean Connery, Robin Williams, Charles Grodin, Tom Berenger, Daniel Day-Lewis, Denzel Washington, Sam Neill, and Tom Conti. Now, what's interesting is there definitely is obvious chemistry between Gere and Roberts, and in fact, the two of them even felt that in their first meeting. But Gere was actually going to turn down the role. Then, Roberts actually slid a post it note over to him which said, "Please say yes." Once he got that note, he accepted the role right away. Here's something interesting you may or may not know, but 10 years before this film came out, Richard Gere was actually a male prostitute in a movie called American Gigolo. So in this film, Jason Alexander plays the character of Philip Stuckey. But did you happen to know that his Seinfeld co-star, Wayne Knight, was also up for that role? The character of Kit DeLuca is played by Laura San Giacomo, but the character was almost played by either Demi Moore or Valerie Bertinelli. Did you happen to notice the cameo by Hank Azaria as this detective? This movie was unfortunately Ralph Bellamy's final film. The actor who plays the waiter that catches the snail would actually reappear in another Gary Marshall series of movies called The Princess Diaries, where he also plays a waiter and even says the exact same line. By the way, can we all admit that Hector Elizondo's character of Barney Thompson is by far the best character in this film? Here's something I found fascinating. Did you know that in all posters for this film, that's actually not Julia Roberts' body? That's her head, but it's superimposed on Shelley Michelle's body, who was her body double for this film. Also, for some reason in the posters, they decided to dye Richard Gere's hair brown instead of the salty gray that it is in the movie. Speaking of Richard Gere, in the scene where he's playing the piano, that is actually Gere doing that. The necklace that appears in the film, by the way, was not a fake prop. In fact, it was worth $250,000, and during filming, when it wasn't on set, it was being watched by armed security. In the film, the opera that Edward takes Vivian to is called La Traviata. I believe I'm saying that correctly, and it's actually an opera about a prostitute that's falling in love with a wealthy man. The film Runaway Bride from 1999 was essentially a reunion for most of the cast from this film, as you had Gary Marshall, Richard Gere, Julia Roberts, Hector Elizondo, and Larry Miller all reuniting. In 2018, the movie was still popular enough that it received a stage musical. So when it comes to the film Pretty Woman, I really enjoy this movie. It's probably one of my favorite rom-coms, and I especially enjoy Julia Roberts' performance in this. So I think I'm going to give this movie a 4 out of 5. Also, if you did really enjoy this movie, other movies I recommend checking out are My Fair Lady, Made in Manhattan, How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, and any of the Princess Diaries movies. Now, as for the trivia question from the beginning of this episode, what song is Vivian singing while taking a bubble bath? This is a great scene in the film where Vivian is in the bubble bath with a Walkman on, and she is singing the song Kiss by Prince. Now, just as a side note to anyone out there, if you want to pretty woman me for a week, I can't guarantee the sexy stuff, but I'll hang out with you for $3,000, no problem. Now, if you did enjoy this episode of Askewed Reviews, make sure to recommend any other movies you want to see get a review in the comments.